What would you do if the woman who walked into your garage with a broken-down Harley turned out to be the heir to a billion-dollar empire, running away from the very life everyone else would kill to have? He had no idea who she was, and she never planned to stay. But one small act of kindness changed everything. And the strangest part? She had walked away 100 times before, but this time she came back. Some people never stop running. Scarlett Monroe was one of them. Born into the spotlight of a financial empire, she turned her back on it all. Power, wealth, status. She left without a second glance. From Manhattan to the deserts of Arizona, from five-star hotels to dusty gas stations on the edge of nowhere. Scarlett lived like the horizon was always calling her name, until one day, her Harley-Davidson betrayed her on a sunburnt highway in the middle of Montana. It was just a small breakdown, but it opened the door to an entirely different world. She rolled into Maple Cross Ridge, a town so quiet it didn't even show up on travel maps. A place where everyone knew each other's names, where the church bell still rang at 5 p.m., and kindness was the most common form of currency. Scarlett wasn't looking for anyone. All she wanted was a bottle of water, a mechanic, and the road again. But just as she pulled over, the engine hissing beneath her, the wooden doors of the garage creaked open, and he walked into her story. Ethan Wells, a mechanic with oil-stained hands and eyes that held no judgment. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't care who she was. He looked at the bike and simply said, "I can fix it, but it'll take a while if you're not in a rush." Scarlett looked up at the stranger, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to run. And right there, at Wells and Company Garage, it wasn't the bike that started to get fixed. It was her heart. The Harley sat in the corner, forgotten for a while, and in that thick air filled with grease and metal, something entirely different began to stir. Ethan Wells wasn't like anyone Scarlett had ever met. He didn't ask where she was headed, didn't blink at the bike or the rebellious fire in her eyes. He just focused on every little detail, touching the engine like it spoke a quiet language only he could understand. Scarlett kept her distance at first. It was second nature. But then a bolt slipped from the workbench, a raised eyebrow from Ethan, and he handed her a wrench. "If you've got a minute, I won't say no to an extra pair of hands." Just a small moment, but it was the first thread, connecting two strangers from entirely different worlds. They worked in silence, not the awkward kind, but the kind that slows time down. Scarlett watched his hands, calloused and worn, each scar a story of someone who had truly lived, loved, and lost. While wiping her hands without really thinking, she asked, "So why'd you stay in a town like this?" Ethan answered without hesitation, "Some things you just can't take with you, so I chose to keep them here." A simple sentence, but something cracked open inside her, because she too had been carrying more than she could name. And for the first time she wondered, was there a place, was there someone, where she didn't have to keep leaving? Ethan once thought Scarlett was just another passerby, one of those drifters who showed up at his garage, left behind a bit of road dust, and disappeared without a trace. But he was wrong. She didn't just know how to tighten a bolt. She understood engines like someone raised on the sound of hammers and the smell of motor oil. Every move she made was precise, instinctual, no questions asked. And that was exactly what made Ethan uneasy. People with skills like that don't just end up in a town like Maple Cross Ridge by accident. He started noticing things. The way she went silent when her phone rang, how her eyes flickered whenever someone mentioned family, or the nights she sat outside the garage, staring into the distance like she was bracing for a storm that never came. And then, one foggy, rain-soaked afternoon, everything cracked open. A man stepped into the garage, impeccably dressed, polite voice, but eyes sharp like hidden blades. "Scarlett Monroe? Your father's waiting." She froze. Ethan looked at her, and in that moment he knew. She wasn't running from her past. Her past was chasing her down. The man wasn't an ex. He wasn't an enemy. He was the personal assistant to Richard Monroe, her father, the head of one of Manhattan's most powerful financial empires. Ethan took a step back. Not out of fear, but because for the first time, he found himself wondering, can you really trust someone who spent their whole life hiding who they are? It started with a cup of black coffee at Harper's Corner Cafe, where Scarlett always took the back table by the window, pretending to read the paper while her eyes drifted toward the garage across the street. Ethan would quietly bring her a cup with extra sugar, even though she never asked and he never said a word. Then came the nights at the dusty Lantern Bar, when the town had long gone to sleep and they sat side by side for no particular reason. They didn't talk much, just traded soft stories about the vintage bike they were restoring, the dirt road Ethan used to race down as a kid, or a dream Scarlett once had and somehow lost along the way. And the days blurred together inside the workshop, where the scent of metal and grease mingled with quiet laughter, where they slowly learned how to touch each other's loneliness without making it hurt. One time when a sudden spark from the welder hit Scarlett's hand, Ethan reached out instinctively, grabbing her wrist, not because of the burn, but because his worry overpowered any urge to keep his distance. Their eyes locked in that instant, and no words were needed. That same night, she left a worn-out screwdriver on his workbench, with a tiny hand-carved message etched into the handle, for the one who never gives up. She used to believe she didn't belong anywhere, but maybe she'd been wrong, because sometimes the strongest connections start with the smallest things, a glance, a quiet laugh, and someone who's willing to fix a heart that's long since worn out. Scarlett Monroe had met all kinds of people on her journey, those who were curious, those who judged, and those who pitied her. But only Ethan Wells, the quiet garage owner with storm-colored eyes, never asked why she kept running and never stopped. He didn't need to know what had driven her away from the glittering world she once belonged to. He never pressed about her past. He simply placed a cup of hot tea on the table in the mornings, handed her a towel when grease stained her hands, and always left the seat next to him open at lunch, as if he already knew that one day she'd choose to sit there on her own. His silence was the first place she had ever felt safe, and that terrified her, because the closer she got to him, the clearer it became. She was tired, tired of trying to prove who she was. With him, she didn't have to. She could just be awkward, quiet, wounded, but real. One late afternoon, while they were working together on an old pickup truck, Ethan gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Scarlett, you don't have to go, not unless you truly want to." She froze, not because of the invitation, but because, for the first time, she realized she didn't want to go anywhere. Not all people have the grace to avoid asking what you're running from, but sometimes what you need isn't someone demanding to know your reasons. It's someone who quietly tells you, you could stop here if you want. The autumn festival at Maple Cross Ridge was always full of life, lanterns glowing in every color, country music echoing through the square, and the warm scent of cinnamon apple pie drifting through the crisp evening air. Scarlett stood on the sidelines, hands still stained with engine grease, with no intention of joining in. But then she saw him, Ethan Wells, kneeling in the middle of the crowd, fixing a little girl's bicycle. Her cheeks were streaked with tears from a fall, but he didn't ask what had happened, didn't wait for someone to call him over. He simply knelt down, slipped the chain back in place, checked the wheels, then pulled a tissue from his jacket pocket and smiled. "All done, princess." That moment, so simple, so unpolished, hit Scarlett like a quiet wave crashing through her. Because she realized then, Ethan's kindness wasn't reserved just for her. He was always like that, always doing the right thing, quietly, even when no one was watching. Scarlett turned away, eyes stinging, not from emotion, but from shame. Shame that she, who had walked away from so many chances to love and be loved, was now being trusted by someone like him. When Ethan walked up and handed her a cup of hot chocolate, he didn't say a word, but in that silence was everything she needed to hear. "I see you, and I'm still here." Sometimes the person who touches your heart doesn't do it with grand gestures or romantic lines, but with a quiet act of kindness meant for someone else. And that's when Scarlett finally understood. Real love doesn't come from declarations. It comes from the things that don't need to be said. Scarlett Monroe used to believe there was no place in the world for someone like her. She had changed her name, her city, even the way she lived, just to make sure no one could ever really know her. But in a quiet little town draped in maple leaves and the distant chime of church bells, every reason she'd had to leave suddenly didn't seem strong enough anymore. One foggy morning, when she arrived at the garage before Ethan, a single gesture made her heart stumble. A cup of coffee left on the workbench, with a pencil-scribbled note that read, "If you're still here tomorrow morning, that would make me happy." Scarlett stood frozen, her hand trembling. Not because of the words themselves, but because for the first time in so long, someone wasn't trying to hold her back. Yet somehow, they made her want to stay. That afternoon at Harper's Corner Cafe, with wind brushing softly against the window panes, she watched the townsfolk of Maple Cross Ridge walk by one, gentle-eyed, unhurried. They didn't know who she was, but they smiled, because she was sitting next to Ethan, and somehow that was enough. In that quiet moment, the weight of her past softened into nothing more than a distant shadow. She wasn't running anymore. She no longer feared the question, "Where do I belong?" Because now, the answer wasn't a place. It was a person. That night at Driftwood Inn, a quiet little lodge tucked at the foot of the hill, Scarlett was folding her blanket, getting ready to leave, when the door suddenly burst open. A stranger stepped in, eyes sharp as blades, suit tailored to perfection, and a voice she could never mistake. "Scarlett Monroe, I'm Ryan Mercer. Your father sent me." The air turned to ice. The blanket slipped from her hands. That name, she had buried it years ago. She'd walked away from her family, from power, and from the Monroe legacy 8 years earlier, swearing never to look back. But Ryan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid a folded newspaper on the table, front page headline in bold print. "The Monroe Empire's missing heiress. Where is she now?" "You're the majority shareholder," he said, "and right now, someone's trying to strip you of everything." Scarlett stood frozen, not because of the money, but because, in that moment, it hit her. Ethan didn't know. She had kept the truth from him, from everyone in this town. And now it wasn't just her secret that was unraveling. It was trust. She turned away, tears slipping down silently. No one knew. She had chosen to live as an ordinary woman, to be loved for who she really was. But the moment Ryan walked through that door, that choice was no longer hers. The news hit like a storm, silent but unstoppable. That morning at Harper's Corner Cafe, every gaze locked onto the newspaper spread across the wooden table. The missing heiress of the Monroe Empire, living among us. Ethan looked up. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the old photo of Scarlett. Those eyes, that face. Unmistakable. But what cut deeper than the shock was the silence. Not once had she told him. Not after all the nights fixing engines side by side, sharing dinners, exchanging pieces of themselves in small, quiet ways. She knew he'd been abandoned before, left without warning, without answers. And yet this time, she was the one who left without a word. He left the garage in a quiet storm, heading to Driftwood Inn, only to find her room empty. The helmet no longer hung by the door, the leather jacket gone from its hook, and in that instant, Ethan understood. She had left. Again. The question he had never dared to ask now roared inside him like an engine that refused to start. Was I ever enough for her to trust from the very beginning? It wasn't betrayal. It was the slow unraveling of hope that had only just begun to take root. But what Ethan didn't know was that Scarlett had left one final thing behind. Beneath her pillow lay a handwritten letter, never delivered, and a rusted ring set with a faded green stone, the only thing she'd ever kept from her mother. Rain pounded against the tin roof of the garage as a storm rolled through Maple Cross Ridge. Scarlett stood at the door of Wells and Company. Garage, her coat soaked through, a dim flashlight in hand barely cutting through the darkness. She had come back, knowing Ethan might never forgive her, knowing her pride stung as sharply as the cold wind seeping through her chest. But she had to say it. She had to face him. The door creaked open. Ethan was there, standing in the same place as always. Only this time his eyes weren't angry, just quiet. "Why did you come back?" His voice was hoarse, not cold, just tired. Scarlett placed the letter on the table, her hand trembling. "Because I couldn't bear to lose the one thing I didn't have the courage to admit mattered, until I almost lost it." There was no embrace, no tearful explosion, just a space between them, thin as breath, yet deep enough to ache. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then turned back in silence, wiping down an old spark plug on the workbench. He didn't speak, but Scarlett didn't leave. She sat down in the passenger chair, just like she had the very first day they met, and waited for him to finish. And somehow, it was that silence that began to untie everything. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She stayed without knowing what would come next, because she understood once trust is cracked, it can't be patched with words, only with time and presence. So when he handed her a grease-stained rag instead of sending her away, it was the smallest gesture, the quietest invitation, offered from a heart still bruised, but not done believing. Flames tore through the second floor of Zoe's book nook, just as the sun slipped below the horizon, ripping through the calm that usually wrapped around the town like a blanket. People rushed in panic, shouting, helpless. But Ethan didn't wait for the fire trucks. He bolted straight into the inferno the moment he heard Zoe Parker, the elderly owner, was still trapped inside. Scarlett had just arrived when she saw his silhouette vanish into the smoke. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She tore off her coat, wrapped it around her face, and ran after him, as if the only instinct she had left was, he won't face this alone. Inside, smoke stung her eyes and heat scorched every breath. Zoe lay unconscious beneath a fallen bookshelf. Ethan struggled to lift her, but stumbled. Scarlett crawled over, gripped the old woman's hand, and together, breathless and burning, they pulled her out. When the door finally burst open and the three of them emerged, the crowd erupted. Ethan turned to Scarlett. His eyes no longer held distance, but something different, something like realization. In that split second when nothing else mattered, she had chosen to stand beside him, not because of who she was, but because of who she had become. And when his hand found hers, just for a fleeting second, Scarlett understood. Forgiveness wouldn't come all at once, but trust had begun to grow again, from the ashes. Smoke still lingered in the air as a thin blanket was draped over Scarlett's shoulders. She sat beside Zoe Parker, the elderly woman they just pulled from the flames, and listened to the rhythm of her own heartbeat. It wasn't fear she felt. It was something far rarer, something she'd never fully allowed herself to believe in. She belonged here. Across from her, Ethan stood silent, his shirt singed, eyes rimmed red, saying nothing. He didn't ask, didn't accuse. He just waited, the way he always had. Scarlett looked around. The people of Maple Cross Ridge, once strangers, were gathering to clear the wreckage as if it were their own home. A little girl slipped her a cup of hot cocoa. An old man patted her shoulder with a gentle smile. No one mentioned her last name. No one cared about titles or the secrets she once kept. And in that unremarkable, ordinary moment, Scarlett understood. This was what she'd been chasing. Not glittering parties, not the life mapped out for her. But this, kind people, a man who never needed to ask about her past, and a town small enough that every voice mattered. She rose to her feet and walked toward Ethan, not to say goodbye this time. Looking into his eyes, voice trembling, she said, "If you're still willing to give me a chance, I won't run again. I want to stay." And there, in the middle of the ashes, something new began, and it wasn't temporary anymore. On the wooden steps of the old Driftwood Inn, the night wind whispered through the trees like a soft closing of a chapter. Scarlett stepped out after a long day, tired but more at peace than she had been in years. Ethan was already there, leaning against the porch column, streaks of paint still marking his hands from fixing the fire-damaged roof. He didn't speak, just stood quietly, as if waiting or simply making sure she no longer had to stand alone. Scarlett stopped. Their eyes met for a few long seconds. Then she spoke, her voice low, each word pulled from somewhere deep and honest. I don't want to run anymore. It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration, a choice. Ethan didn't answer with words. He simply reached out his hand, unhurried, unforced. Scarlett looked at it, the calluses worn into his skin by years of honest work, the kind of steadiness that never needed to shout. And she placed hers into it. And for the first time, Ethan held her hand tightly. Like if he just held on long enough, maybe all that had once broken could be made whole again. By this silence. No kiss, no promises. Just, I believe you. Spoken through the way he didn't let go. And somehow, that was enough to change everything. Scarlett didn't leave anymore. Each morning she opened the garage with Ethan, wiping oil from her hands with the same faded rag he'd handed her that very first day. No one said it aloud, but everyone saw it. She wasn't just a passerby anymore. She had become part of the rhythm of this place. When Zoe's bookstore burned down, Scarlett was the first to stand in the middle of Stone Pine Square, hand raised, calling for volunteers to rebuild. Over the next 3 weeks, she swung hammers, hauled wood, brewed coffee for the repair crew. Day by day, she saw her reflection in Zoe Parker's grateful smile, in the awe-filled eyes of children lining up to return their books to newly built shelves. She no longer dodged questions about her real name, nor flinched at the occasional curious glance. Because somewhere along the way, she'd stopped asking herself, how long can I stay? One late afternoon, Ethan handed her the spare key to the garage. No explanation, just a quiet, won't be in early tomorrow. Think you can open up? A simple sentence, almost careless, but it tightened something in Scarlett's chest. Maybe for the first time in her life, she didn't have to leave before someone had the chance to trust her. In a town that once felt like nowhere, she had found something she never truly believed existed, a place called home, not because it had walls or a roof, but because someone was waiting there. The love between Ethan and Scarlett didn't begin with a promise. It arrived slowly, like the first light of winter, gentle, steady, and never needing a name. They didn't hold hands every day, but after every finished repair, Ethan would quietly leave a warm piece of cornbread on Scarlett's workbench. She never said thank you, just made sure his grease rag was washed, folded, and tucked into the drawer he always forgot to close. Their love had no anniversaries, no photos pinned to the wall. But each evening, as the town softened into stillness, Scarlett would sit on the porch, waiting for the familiar rumble of Ethan's old pickup. He rarely said much, just sat beside her, his shoulder resting quietly against hers. On the first day snow fell, they placed a small potted pine tree outside the newly rebuilt bookstore. No words were exchanged, but both of them knew. This place, this season, had become theirs. And one cold night, with the wind brushing through the trees, Scarlett rested her head against Ethan's chest and whispered, "We don't have to go anywhere anymore, do we?" He didn't answer, just held her hand a little tighter. Because sometimes love doesn't need grand declarations, just someone willing to sit with you long enough that you no longer feel alone. The wind whispered through the pines like echoes of the past. Scarlett stood beside Ethan at Whispering Bluff Overlook, where just one glance could take in the entire town below. The tiny cafe with its weathered blue tile roof, the garage where Ethan had spent years bent beneath engines and frames. Arms folded, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. There was no more hesitation in her posture, no trace of the woman who once ran from anything that felt like a tether. Only eyes, wet but steady, looking out over the lights flickering gently beneath the hill. "I used to think I belonged somewhere else, somewhere bigger." "Farther," she murmured, gaze tracing the golden glow of the town below. "But no one in those places ever looked at me the way you did, when all I had was a bike and a few scratches on my hands." Ethan tightened his hold on her, still silent, because sometimes the answer didn't live in promises. It lived in the fact that he had never left her side, no matter who she was. A sudden gust of wind swept past, carrying a handful of brittle leaves into the painted dusk, like the universe itself was offering quiet approval. Scarlett smiled, turned toward him, and said softly, but with the weight of something true, "Maybe this is where I was meant to be." And for the first time in years of running, she felt no urge to go anywhere else. Snow had begun to fall, soft, slow, like whitewashed memories drifting down onto rooftops, quiet streets, and the weathered tin of Wells and Company. Garage, a place that had once borne witness to silence, to tentative touches, into two lives slowly, unexpectedly, finding their way toward each other. Inside the garage, the warm glow of a single light spilled over Ethan's shoulders as he wiped down his toolbox. An old habit, one he'd done 1,000 times before. But this time, something had changed. From behind, Scarlett stepped forward. The thick coat she wore couldn't block out the bite of the cold, but the way her arms wrapped around him, from behind, gently certainly, carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the heater humming in the corner. Because after everything, she had chosen to stay. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her cheek resting against the back that had weathered so many storms for others, yet had forgotten how to shield its own heart. Ethan turned to her, reaching up to touch her face, for the first time without hesitation, without fear. Just eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Because some people don't need to be asked to stay. They simply do. Outside, Maple Cross Ridge lay beneath a hush of falling snow, like a love song only the town could hear. And inside that old garage, two hearts, once fractured, once lost, had finally found their shelter. Not because of promises, not because of the past, but because of 7 quiet words. "I'm not going anywhere." And that was how they knew they belonged to each other. The lesson from this story: someone who stays for love, not obligation. Life is sometimes like Scarlett's motorcycle, speeding forward one moment, then breaking down in the middle of nowhere the next, for what seems like the smallest reason, a mechanical failure. But in truth, it's often fate's quiet way of steering us exactly where we need to be healed. Scarlett didn't run because she was weak. She ran because the world only saw her through the lens of legacy, power, and expectation. She was exhausted from having to constantly perform, to be someone she wasn't, when all she wanted was to be herself. And in the tiny town of Maple Cross Ridge, where no one knew her name, she finally found the space to live honestly. Ethan was no different, a man who seemed self-contained, needing no one, yet deep down carried a heart still capable of love, still willing to wait, and brave enough to open again. Not because of obligation, but because he saw something in Scarlett, someone hiding a pain that looked too much like his own. Their story teaches us something quietly powerful. Sometimes what we need isn't a place to escape to, but a person who makes us stop wanting to run. And belonging isn't about location. It's about finding the gaze that truly sees you, without judgment, without demands. That lesson is soft-spoken, yet strong enough to stir any heart that's ever felt alone. Real love doesn't hold you in place with promises. It holds you with the peace you can't seem to find anywhere else. Et le one swan.